Have you ever realized that there's a generation that grew up when the internet didn't exist? And no, they're not part of ancient history. These are people who grew up in a world where connecting meant knocking on someone's door, where you had to solve boredom yourself, and where your embarrassing moments weren't documented online forever. These are people who learned to navigate without GPS, who figured out how to survive childhood without their parents knowing where they were every second of the day like they do today. This is a generation that possesses a different way of thinking, problem solving, and moving through the world that sets them apart from every generation that came after. Today we're talking about the generation that grew up without the internet, about the generation that knew how to go on a trip using a roadmap, not GPS, and why their minds function so differently. Today, we're discussing Generation X. To understand why Gen X doesn't complain, we need to go back to 1978. Imagine an 8-year-old coming home to an empty house because both parents are working. No smartphone to call for help, no doorbell camera to check who's outside, no GPS for parents to track where the child is. About 7 million children aged 5 to 13 were regularly unsupervised after school during that period. Many came home to empty apartments, unlocked doors with keys hanging around their necks, and figured out their own afternoons until their parents returned from work. They called them latchkey kids, and this wasn't rare. It was common. Divorce rates were rising. Both parents were entering the workforce. And, unlike today, there was no societal panic about unsupervised children. Society simply accepted that children would spend a significant part of their day alone raising themselves. What does that do to a developing mind? It creates radical self-reliance. When you're 8 years old, making your own snacks, entertaining yourself for hours, and solving your own problems because there's literally no adult to ask, you develop a specific psychological framework. You learn that you are your own primary resource. This wasn't neglect in most cases. It was circumstance. And that circumstance shaped a generation of people who instinctively don't seek external help when they encounter a problem. Their first thought is, how do I solve this myself? That self-reliance became ingrained. It wasn't a conscious choice. It's their basic operating system. And today, when parents leave their child with grandparents just to finish some errands around town, they rush back worrying whether their child will be hungry, thirsty. The latchkey phenomenon was just part of a broader puzzle. People who grew up without the internet came of age during a period of deep instability. The Cold War cast a nuclear shadow over everyday life. The economy went through recessions. AIDS emerged as a terrifying pandemic with no cure. The news was full of stories about dangerous strangers, satanic panic, and a general sense that the world was a dangerous and unpredictable place. Psychologists call this a high-risk environment, a world where outcomes seem uncertain and threats are real. The psychological effect of growing up in such a world? You develop protective cynicism. You learn not to take things for granted. You learn that authorities aren't always right. You learn that the future isn't guaranteed, so it's better to develop real skills and abilities rather than rely on systems that might fail you. If you can't rely on institutions, parents, or systems to save you, what can you rely on? Your skills, your knowledge, your ability to actually do things. People who grew up without the internet developed an almost obsessive focus on practical competence, not on diplomas, on capability. Not on appearance, on actual skill. That's why many became the handymen in their families and workplaces. They learned to change their own oil, solve technical problems, fix appliances, not because they loved those tasks, but because waiting for someone else to solve your problem felt psychologically unsafe. The internet generation learned to Google solutions. The pre-internet generation learned to become the solution. And what about today's generation that only knows how to click on a link and scroll through a phone screen, but can't even screw in a light bulb that's burned out? People who grew up without the internet developed their identity in relative anonymity. Your embarrassing phases, mistakes, changes of opinion, none of that was documented and broadcast to the world. Your past didn't follow you in a searchable permanent digital archive. This created a psychology where privacy feels normal and exposure feels threatening. Self-esteem developed without likes, shares, and follower counts. Instead of external metrics, they developed internal validation. Their confidence didn't depend on algorithms, but on direct interactions and internal reflection. Their strength was spiritually strong and unbreakable. They grew up watching scandals like Watergate and corporate fraud. They learned that authority deserves respect only if it's earned through competence and integrity. They experienced real boredom, without smartphones, without endless content. Psychologists say that boredom stimulates creativity and focus. That's why they developed the ability for deep reading, imagination, and concentration on long tasks without losing focus to the internet. They used physical maps, memorized phone numbers, wrote down instructions. This developed different neural pathways and trust in their own memory. Often described as the invisible generation, they functioned as a stable, quiet foundation. Pragmatic, realistic, able to bridge the analog and digital worlds, their psychology is becoming valuable today. Self-reliance, cynicism as protection, focus on competence, privacy instinct, and ability to concentrate. The psychology of people who grew up without the internet is the psychology of a generation taught to expect nothing and rely on themselves. Their minds are shaped to value competence over credentials, privacy over visibility, independence over belonging, and internal validation over external applause. They're not better or worse than generations raised with the internet. They're just fundamentally different in their psychological makeup. And perhaps that's the most important thing to understand. Growing up without constant digital connection doesn't just mean you had a different childhood. It means you developed a different mind. A mind that remembers what it's like to be bored, lost, and alone, and learn to be okay with all three. A mind that doesn't panic when the Wi-Fi goes out because it remembers how to function without it. A mind that built its identity privately, brick by brick, without an audience or scoreboard. In a world that's increasingly realizing the psychological costs of constant connection, maybe there's something to learn from people who grew up without it. They're not the loudest voices in the room. They're not seeking attention or validation, but they're still here, quietly competent, radically self-reliant, and psychologically stable in ways that are becoming harder to find. And maybe that's exactly what the world needs right now.